Thank you so much, Wendell. I appreciate the invite. It'd be awesome to see all your faces in person and have a good excuse to come visit home, but we'll make do with Zoom. So I am going to talk a little bit about low-tech restoration and how you might use it on your ranch. And the purpose is to make sure we're clear on what we mean by low-tech. We'll spend a fair bit of time talking about some principles that I think there's a whole lot of details we can spend a lot of time on, but if there's some core principles that kind of guide our actions and help us understand what a healthy riverscape looks like, and then talk about how that can make for more resilient working lands. So I am going to start off with a little anecdote from one of the ranchers that we work with out here. And then I'll get into what low-tech is, those principles, and some surprising conclusions that it's okay to do things you thought you weren't supposed to. So meet Jay Wilde. Jay is a rancher up in South Idaho, so he's just over the border from Utah here. This is the Birch Creek watershed, which the upper half of is in Forest Service and is in a Forest Service allotment. And then Jay has his deeded ground and ranching operations downstream of that. And that's Bear Lake in the background. And I'm going to just show you something that I think, regardless of where we are in the West, it was a sort of a common story. All this is just a little wheel, and I'm going to show this wheel a few times, just showing how grazing management has changed. And what historically happened there is everybody that was part of that allotment, all the permittees, basically had their cows overwintering on their private ranches, and then they'd turn them out sometime in May onto the Forest Service land, and then round them up in September. And so you can imagine what that meant. No management, right? Just turn them out and put them on the allotment. There were about 333 permits. And in terms of, well, you know, I'm obviously not a rancher. Jay explains to me that it's pretty simple. Cows need two things to survive, something to eat and something to drink, right? And so what that really meant is, even though this to the left here is where some of the deeded ground is, and then to the right, this is up on the Forest Service allotment, something like a 2,100 acre allotment. And that little green area, that's what I mean by riverscape. That's the valley bottom. And that's where the cows actually were that entire time, right? And so that riparian area was pretty hammered. And we see this typical response. They shortened that grazing season from mid-May to September down to June 16th to August 15th, and they cut the number of permits in half. This is sort of a tired old story. This is back in the mid-60s, by the way. And so, you know, it's logical if it's overgrazed, you know, let's shorten the season and let's shorten the cows. Well, here's what happened. They're in the exact same place and it still looked like garbage. So there's not a lot of success from cutting those numbers there. So little tangent. When I'm saying riverscape, there's a reason for that. We know our rivers and streams are critically important to freshwater ecosystems, but we've been too obsessed in managing these as just channels, just ditches that convey water. And we've also been, as we've seen impacts to streams, we've also been quick to point those, and sometimes rightly so, like in the example I'm showing, at the cows. And, you know, keep the cows out, fence the riparian, you can't be in there. This is the sort of common mantra that comes from the sort of, you know, fish squeezer side of the community that I play with. So our riverscapes, they're really your valley bottom. And we define those as they're the part of the landscape that could plausibly flood by their rivers and streams in the natural flow regime. This is important because it focuses on this as a land management activity to have healthy riverscapes and healthy riverine and aquatic ecosystems, as opposed to just, you know, this other silo. And so also those riverscapes are critically important for those two things that Jay told me cows apparently need: water and forage, especially in areas like I live, or where a lot of you live, where we have a pretty rough typical summer drought. And so we're going to be chasing those sort of resources. So in most of the West, our valley bottoms make up about 5 to 10% of the landscape. Yet what's left in terms of riparian typically is in that 2 to 4% range. That's a reflection of how we've managed these riverscapes to be more efficient and not focused on them as a whole system. So what Jay did is he was gone for a while from the ranch. He came back. And in 2003, when he took over, they were in quite a bit of trouble still with the Forest Service, the Grazing Association, and the permittees there. So he got the hot potato of running the thing. And I'm going to show you a series of maps in this same sort of temporal cartoon. And so, you know, Jay starts out, he actually overwinters his cows somewhere else, but he starts out and he's got a whole series of pastures, early season pastures. He spends about a day on them each. And then what he does is then he turns them out. And so we've got little arrows for how long here. And then these are just the pastures that they've developed on that allotment. And this is, you know, this is just, you know, high intensity, short duration, rotational grazing schemes, nothing new. But it's really important that as he's going around, he's basically chasing that green line and moving the cows around to take advantage of this big allotment that actually has a lot of potentially good forage. He also had to develop a number of springs and off-channel watering. And then in the end, towards the end of the summer, he splits them out to these two upper pastures. And then for typically it's only a week, but he's got 1 to 2 weeks where he's running them back down the riparian. So contrast that with what we started with, which is turn them out the other side of the fence and then round them up, you know, however many months later. And so, as Jay will admit, this is a bit more work, but what it did was has led to a much healthier riparian, and then that riparian is also providing really good forage as in the late season as those cows are making their way back down. Now, and this is a picture earlier in the season down on Jay's deeded ground and looking upstream. So what's happened since the 80s on Birch Creek is that this is mapped as a perennial blue line stream, those solid lines on those old USGS quads, right? But it's not anymore. It dries up. It's gone intermittent. Now, some of that is probably excess evapotranspiration from fire suppression and fuel loading up on the forest. But Jay also noticed that, you know, about the time it dried up was about the time he remembers seeing the last beaver in this system. And so he had a goal of wanting to make that stream flow again, or at least make it flow later in the season. And this is going to be our sort of transition to BDAs. Now, we could look at that because the riparian was in good enough shape to support beaver activity. That's important. And that has everything to do with the grazing management. But we were able to tackle a project, and I'll come back to this at the very end, because of his work there. Part of the story, there's an article in Beef Magazine where Jay tells a bit of this story, and some videos and stuff on here. I did post in the chat a link to the slides, and all of these have links to these things if those are of any interest to you. So now I'm gonna step away from Jay's anecdote for a second and fill in some of these pieces on what's low tech and what are these principles that we can use to sort of drive our actions in trying to restore some of these riverscapes. So low tech process-based restoration is just a practice of using simple, low unit cost structural additions. So things like wood and beaver dams to riverscapes to mimic functions and promote specific processes. Now that's all well and good, but basically we're dealing with systems that have been structurally starved of wood and of beaver dams for decades to centuries, depending on where you're at. And so really you could think of this stuff as providing a meal of those sorts of things to kick off those processes and help nourish them back to health. Now, the typical meals that we prepare, these are the sort of go-tos. There's a lot of other things you can use, but post-assisted log structures and beaver dam analogs. Now, those are definitely pretty simple, low-tech things. You can see examples of things like this being built in the 1800s. It's not a new idea, but don't confuse these actions as the solution. This is just what we can do with a little sweat and hard work. What these are for, they're hand-built structures that mimic and promote the processes of wood accumulation, mimic and promote the processes of beaver dam activity, okay? So there's lots of flavors, lots of ways to do this. And just like cooking a meal, you start out with a recipe when you don't really know what you're doing, you follow that. But as you get more confidence, you can substitute, things in and try different stuff and get creative. So a question to you, is this the P in process-based restoration, what these folks are doing here? And if you were listening to what I just said, it's not. Yes, we've co-opted this from some unnamed company. So far, they haven't sued us. But the P are the processes. The low tech is what these folks are doing right here. And so what we've got to remember in that silly little logo is that it's the processes of wood accumulation. Wood gets recruited naturally into systems, and it accumulates in jams, right? Big piles of wood. That makes for healthier riverscapes. Beaver dams, while annoying if they're in your irrigation ditch, and there are some easy things to mitigate that, can do a lot to maintaining the health of a riverscape. So the structures are low tech. They can be built without expensive engineering, and we don't need a degree in rocket science to do that sort of stuff. So our desired attributes of low-tech restoration is hand-built structures of natural materials. And we got lots of degraded riverscapes. So we want something that's simple and cost-effective so it can scale up to that scope. More importantly for scaling up is if the processes take over, then there's that multiplier effect. And so you're letting the system do the work. Also, more people can be involved in preparing these meals and throwing these parties, if you will. We've wrote some stuff that was mentioned earlier that kind of attempts to define a standard of practice for this, and that's been adopted by numerous federal and state agencies. California, for some reasons we could get into in discussion, has been a little slow. Surprisingly, but is coming around slowly but surely. So those are available for free online and at those websites. So I'm going to cover the principles, and the 4 principles I want to start with are just recognizing what a healthy riverscape looks like. That something like this wasn't a rarity historically. These weren't anomalous. These were pervasive, even in California. And so if we understand what a healthy riverscape looks like, then we have a good target. So streams need space is the first principle. Structure, like a beaver dam, forces complexity, like flooding, even at low flow, and that makes for a more resilient system. How important that structure is, well, it depends. It depends on things you can go get degrees in, but like that's just our favorite 2 words in the natural sciences. It depends. And then inefficiency, not efficiency. Inefficiency, the inefficient conveyance of water is actually a hallmark of a healthy system. And that's the antithesis of how we've managed our systems. So the streams need space. It doesn't have to mean that they can't share it. Right? If you have good grazing management, these sorts of things are making better forage, and so we can actually share this space, but we do have to recognize what rivers might do and have expectation management therein. Now, structure forcing complexity. Basically, things like these dams and jams. They change the velocities and depths. There's a whole cascade of processes. The end result is it makes more complex habitat that instead of just being built as piles of sediment that's easily erodible, it's more like a carbon fiber matrix of all sorts of organic material mixed in with this. And that does make it more resilient. So when we talk about resilience, it's important to clarify resilient to what and from yet what is it that you're resilient to, and what is it that's resilient. So maybe it's our water resources, maybe it's our rangelands, maybe it's our riverscapes. That depends on your perspective, but resilience is just the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. It's a lack of sensitivity to disturbance. And California is no stranger to disturbances like fire, drought, floods, right? And these things threaten our water resources. They threaten the health of our riverscapes. They threaten these rangelands. And this is an example from a study that was recently published where what we're looking at on the bottom axis is years since some restoration action, and on the vertical is a measure of resiliency. So the resiliency we're talking about is green, basically production of vegetation in that valley bottom. And we're looking at that as a function of precipitation, okay? So the way to read this is if you're low on this vertical axis, if you have a wet year, you got a lot of green. If you got a dry year, you got brown. If you look up on the high end of the axis, that's basically, doesn't matter if it's a drought or if it's flood, it's still green. That productivity is resilient. And what we're seeing, these dots, this is from an example, John Griggs tells a great story about this out in Nevada of just changing the grazing management. And that allowed the recovery of the riparian vegetation such that beaver came in without any help. They came in on their own and put a bunch of structure that forced this into a much more resilient system through some of the worst droughts in Nevada's history. And so this is really kind of exciting to see that pan out. We're seeing other examples by saving little wet meadows up in headwaters. That's up in Colorado. This is out in Oregon, using these beaver dam analogs and getting beaver to come in. And we see these similar sorts of responses in these valley bottoms. So really encouraging. Now this one's another example of resilience. And this is a really difficult scientific concept. Bear with me. Water does not burn. Right? So this is basically an example from Idaho. This was a 60,000 acre fire that torched this watershed, burnt the riparian right to the ground, pretty much ever, except where these damn rodents had flooded up the valley bottom sponge. And this was really important wildlife refugia and livestock refugia during the fire. In some places where the valley bottom was big enough, it was actually also a fire break. And so this is really exciting. And then in a post-fire runoff, it was as well a really important sort of buffer for those elevated flows and that sediment. And there's a fun article in National Geographic on this. Came out a little bit ago and highlighted some of Emily Fairfax's work quantifying these benefits. And Emily's a professor there in California. So the fourth principle, inefficient conveyance of water is healthy. This is counterintuitive to how we've managed our water resources. Get water from point A to point B. The best example of that, the Los Angeles River. Isn't it beautiful? And that's been a failure from a flood control perspective. Actually, it turns out attenuation works much better. But even water resources managers, if they'll admit it, know this. They know this principle. It's snowpack, right? If everything falls as rain, it falls and it runs off right away. If you've got it locked up in snow, you hold on to it longer and it slowly releases it out. It's exactly what's happening with this beaver dam complex, which is about the most inefficient mess you could imagine. And this is actually going back to Jay's land. This is a meadow he didn't want us to work in, and the beaver had other ideas and moved down into. He didn't want us to work here because he had a bunch of MIM sites and he was monitoring how good a job they're doing grazing. But he's pretty happy with this because this filled up the sponge. It knocks the peak off of those floods. So the flood peaks are slower. It attenuates that into this sponge and slowly leaks it out so that we're getting closer to having year-round flows down back on his deeded ground. A simple way you can quantify this, you just take a snapshot of how much land is inundated in the valley bottom, is underwater at low flow. And here's an example, the same riverscape on the top, 5% at low flow. The exact same flow a few years later with beaver moved into that system, and you've got ponded and overflow areas. It's bumping this up to 20%. You're just changing how long the water sticks around as it moves through that system. And we refer to this as the water magic trick because you're not really, even if you elevate base flows, you're not really making any more water. you're changing its timing. And by changing its timing, good things happen. For example, you have a whole bunch of aquatic habitat. You have more habitat. And what really got people excited about low tech was we were able to show a population level response to endangered steelhead from these techniques. So now just to kind of, well, how do we have some, so we don't get too carried away? What guides our actions? So what are some principles there? It's okay to be messy. There's strength in numbers. Use natural building materials. Let the system do the work. Defer decision-making to the system. And self-sustaining systems are the solution. So, anybody who's put a lot of fence in, you're used to putting nice straight and, fence posts perfectly plumb. Turns out they're a little rougher and sloppier. Actually works better a lot of times. And so it's okay to be messy, take some inspiration from those rodents because we're learning that messiness and the dynamics of it are actually what drive health in these systems. There's strength in numbers. This is a little zoom into a short 2-mile stretch of river in a much bigger project. And all the little dots, those are all structures. If I need to spend $5 grand to have an engineer, stamp and design one stupid structure and spend another 10, 15 grand building it, I'm losing the plot. These things have to be a whole bunch of them. And you can afford to lose one, like a Kevin Durant, for example. Although that didn't pan out, I admit, in the last couple of years as well for Golden State, but never mind. So using natural building materials, this is just common sense. If you can get local sources, you can move this stuff as opposed to hauling it in from a long ways, you might as well. Also, I mean, you could put, pressure treated fence posts in or T-posts, but they're going to be there for a while. Why? I could eat a Twinkie, but it'll probably be in my gut for the next 20 years. So this is pretty simple. Really exciting frontier, I think, is just with all the forest treatments and all the fuels reduction treatments that are starting to take place all around the West. We're producing byproducts that don't have commercial value in lowering the density of these things. These are structurally starved riverscapes where we need that sort of material. So there's really good synergies between those things. Letting the system do the work is a phrase borrowed by Bill Zeedyke. And this is actually, we're going to hear from Damien, and his colleague Jared has this great quote. What if restoration was about stream power doing work, not diesel power? And I couldn't agree more. Defer decision-making to the system. I don't need to micromanage this. I just need to have some expectations for the range of things that can go possible and get out of the way and transfer that liability to the ecosystem engineer. And those structures we build, they're not the solution. They are this trajectory of mimic, process, promote it, and get to a self-sustaining situation. And that's kind of what's shown in that sequence there. And returning that concept to Jay and Jay Wilde, here we go. You've got 3 or 4 BDAs in this little reach. This was a stream that was 18 inches wide. Okay, we built these fake beaver dams to provide deeper water to release some nuisance beaver that were clogging up irrigation ditches in another watershed. We live trapped them, gave them a little place to be released, and they're comfortable. Within a couple of weeks, they raised those things 2 to 3 feet. This is about 6 months later. Today, they've flooded this entire valley bottom, and we're up to 175 dams. We built 25, they built 175 and expanded the footprint of that. So pretty neat. There's some cool videos on Life on the Range website and interviews with Jay, kind of talking about the story. Like I said, he does a much better job than me. But the ultimate goal is self-sustaining systems, right? And hopefully ones that can coexist with good grazing and good stewardship there. So it's okay to have a shared vision of resiliency. We don't have to say, actually, well, I'm more concerned about the resiliency of fish, or I'm more concerned about resiliency of my working lands. The shared vision is resiliency, and we can wet up these sponges once again. And it's a piggy bank of natural water storage, of natural infrastructure that increases productivity and makes for more resilient landscapes. This is what Working Lands for Wildlife has been pushing through their sort of sticks and stones sort of work on low tech. And this is even worked into the bureaucracy of the USDA, where we have a cost code, not as an engineering practice, as a conservation practice. And one of the keys there is that it has a design life of less than a year. That doesn't mean the structures you build will only last a year. What it means is that you can go back and tap that pot of money for more to do the follow-ups until it becomes self-sustaining. And that's really, really critical. As most of you probably know, the U.S. Farm Bill with 60 billion, it's slated to potentially be spent up until 2028, is going to be by far the biggest conservation and restoration spending anywhere on the planet. And so if we can tap that to help landowners and producers do this sort of work, that's a huge deal. So if you want to learn more, we do offer a bunch of courses. We have a bunch of self-paced modules online. And I'd just like you to take away, it's okay to do things like be messy, let the system do the work for you, defer decision-making to the rodent, get out of the way, give it space, allow inefficiency, and that's gonna buy you some healthy, resilient riverscapes. So with that, I'll shut up. And if there's any questions, I'd be delighted to try and answer them.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes for questions. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask Joe your questions.
So if you don't have beavers, you're just self-made?
Great question. Beavers aren't appropriate in every system. We can look at whether or not they might have been there historically and whether or not it's possible to get them back again. But in systems that don't, you can do some of these things with, wood accumulation. The beaver tend to be a little more instant gratification and more dramatic responses, but we do see similar responses with wood. You can kickstart things by mimicking, make fake beaver dams to raise water tables and get that riparian response and prep. Yeah, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be beaver alone. It's just that in the cases where they make sense, they really are impressive.
I have a question on the riparian restoration. So there is that area in my property up in the Sierras, in the foothills. And I haven't really paid that much attention to it because for the first 15 years it was drought and they didn't run at all. And then the big floods came and it flooded. And my understanding was that you wanted to kind of keep the sides of the creek clear to some extent, so that the water could flow. But now in the last year or two, and with this as well, I'm understanding that you really do want to leave some of that brush there. And so that's what's going on in a small way. But the creek that flows into my place and goes into Lake McClure, above my place, it's managed by the BLM. Mm-hmm. And it's totally blocked. So I'm wondering, what's the difference between being totally blocked from unmanaged land where everything has fallen into the creek and
we have 3 minutes.
Okay, well that's all. I just, that's totally blocked above my place. There is an underground stream that comes up, but should I do anything with that area above my creek that's totally blocked? I guess.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat with you offline about it. It's hard for me to say without knowing a little more. There is a common sentiment that maybe you're getting at, that if you allow this inefficiency upstream, it's going to steal the water, right?
Right.
And that's there are some situations where that may be the case. What we're seeing more so, though, is there's situations where it probably helps. And where it helps is a fairly localized response, but by the time you get down to bigger main stems where actual water, infrastructure is and actual diversions, these sorts of things, they can have dramatic impacts in those local riverscapes, but they don't necessarily, they're not going to produce a measurable impact or response, by the time you get down to real water resources infrastructure.
A minute and a half.
Okay. Just one thing I'd like to say, Joe, there's a number of questions in the chat. Maybe if you have an opportunity to respond to some of those, that would be useful.